May 20th, 1973. Our camera is facing the northwest corner of 1st and West Grand Avenues as we begin our journey back in time through the eye of another camera. It was from this approximate location that our first picture was photographed and our historical record begins to unfold. The year was 1902, and this West Side community was still adjusting itself to the new name of Grand Rapids. It was just 2 years earlier, in 1900, that the West Side, known as Centralia, joined with Grand Rapids on the east bank of the river under a common name. The transition was not without problems, and it would not be until May 31st of 1904 that the Centralia post office would officially close, the final gasp of a noble community that had been incorporated back in 1856. The street we now know as West Grand Avenue was once called Cranberry Street. Cranberry Street, indeed, a very colorful name for a street with a colorful past. The ornate two-story structure on the extreme right was part of what was known as the McKinnon block. Although it is hard to imagine, this building ran all the way to the river's edge. There was no park area east of 1st Avenue as we know it today. The small frame building just across the street was built about 1859 and was the original location of Nels Johnson Company. Next came a double store building owned by Frank Pemainville. At one time, Gus Otto occupied this building as a drugstore. The upstairs was a hall that was later divided into offices and apartments. Out of view on the right, on 1st Avenue, were several saloons and the Fabvre Building. From this position, we can identify the actual location of the Fabvre Building. In this photograph taken in the 1930s, we see the building pretty much as it appeared at the turn of the century. This was the only building that was left standing when the river block was built, and in this picture it is shown as the photo studio of Oscar Palmquist. This building occupied a very favorable location and was an early day hangout for all who wanted to cross the river on the ferry or use it as an excuse to watch the ferry arrive from the east side. It was actually a saloon with a favorable reputation. The rear of the building was a dwelling that housed many people at various times. It served as a sort of annex to the saloon in the front. Now back to West Grand Avenue, or should we say Cranberry Street. On the left side of the picture, we see a portion of the Centralia Hardware Building. In this photo, which was taken in 1907, we see the complete building. In later years, this became the Nash Hardware and is the present-day location of the Montgomery Ward store. This old lantern slide was once used by the Nash Hardware Company as part of their advertising program. The Rayo lamp. Its beauty, safety, economy, and brilliance are unsurpassed by any other artificial light. For best results, use Perfection Oil. For sale by Nash Hardware Company. To the left of the hardware was a small frame building which Mr. Nash used as a warehouse. This building had been the Centralia Post Office, which was built by H.W. Jackson. We have previously referred to the McKinnon block, of which only a small portion is visible on the right side of the picture, so perhaps this would be a good time to reorient ourselves and show a complete view of the McKinnon building. This photo was taken about 1912. You'll notice that the community could now boast of a trolley line. The streetcar service began regular operation on January 1st, 1910. And ran between Grand Rapids and Nakusa. As previously mentioned, the McKinnon Building ran all the way to the river's edge, paralleling the approach to the bridge, which can be seen on the right side of the picture. The sign prominently displayed on this telephone pole is very blurred, but we're able to determine that spitting on a public sidewalk was punishable by a $5 fine. In this picture, which was taken from the east side of the river, we get a general view of the area just described. You'll notice that the bank of the river south of the bridge was nicely landscaped, pretty much as it is today. It had not always been that way, however. This is how it once looked, as seen by a photographer from the top of the Wood Building. This closer view, taken from the bridge, reveals what an eyesore the area really was. The first building on the right was that of Joseph Madeline. Next was a saloon. The third building was a tailor shop, and next to the tailor shop was Saul Preston's blacksmith shop. Beyond that was a warehouse and livery stable. Notice the small outhouse built to hang out over the river's edge, a typical practice in the days before pollution control. In 1910, a sort of redevelopment group spearheaded by the Women's Federation and assisted by George W. Meade, Theodore Brazo, and others persuaded the city to buy up these shacks, and this area of the river bank was subsequently cleared and landscaped as we know it today. Our next 1973 view will help us locate ourselves for another photo, which was taken in 1896, showing the 2nd Avenue intersection looking northwest. This building was built by Mr. L. Gross in the early 1860s. At the time, he was asked by his neighbors why he built a store so far out in the woods. Not too many years later, the Gross Building and the one-story frame building on the left were occupied by the Johnson and Hill Company. The next building was built in 1887 by J.D. Witter and was the home of the Bank of Grand Rapids, which was later absorbed by the First National. To the left of the bank was a double store building. Frank Garrison ran a general store at this location. It was on March 10th of 1887 that the business people of Centralia were surprised to hear that J.D. Witter had bought out Mr. Garrison's business. On that occasion, Mr. Witter walked into the store and handed Frank his check for $25,000, for which Garrison turned over the key with all as it was except for the accounts. This seemed to be a turning point in Mr. Garrison's business career. For a while he went into business with George Corriveau, Jr., but his real interest began to lean toward the paper and pulp industry, with which he became increasingly involved, and was ultimately general manager of the Nakusa-Edwards Paper Company. Later, the Johnson and Hill Company occupied this building for their dry goods and ladies' furnishing store. The small building on the extreme left was the grocery store of Mr. E. Kellner. Now let's move up to the busy corner of Cranberry Street and 3rd Avenue, as once again we identify our location in this 1973 view, taken from the exact same position as our next photo. The year was 1896, and the description of the occupancies of the building shown here is as they were at that time. As previously mentioned, this was Mr. Kellner's grocery store, which we saw from the opposite end of the block. This building was Homuller's Saloon. Undoubtedly, many a glass was tipped here while the women folk selected their weekly food supply at Mr. Kellner's store. Next to Homuller's Saloon was a small tailor shop of Mr. A. Bankert. To the left of the tailor shop was another saloon, that of Mr. Chamberlain. Were he not a sober-type man, Mr. Bankert might have had all he could do to keep his tape measure straight, what with a saloon on either side of him. To the left of Chamberlain's saloon was Worthington's drugstore. Undoubtedly, Mr. Worthington did a brisk business in hangover remedies in such a location. The corner store was that of George A. Corvo. Now let's turn to the left and view the northwest corner of this intersection. This is as we see it in our 1973 view, but let's go back 111 years in time to another photo taken from this very same position. This home was built in 1862. Our country was at war with itself, and President Lincoln had already completed his first year in office. We see it as it was, picket fence and all, home of the H.W. Jackson family. The Jacksons had moved to Centralia in 1854. Mr. Jackson was the first postmaster of Centralia, his term of office lasting 21 years. In later years, Johnson and Hill bought this property and built their present store building in 1912. Just across the street, the Jacksons had a neighbor. No, it wasn't the First National Bank, as shown here, for on this very spot was located a small frame home. This home was known as the Dudley Barber Shop and Dwelling. It formerly belonged to a Mrs. Knapp and was occupied by her for many years. Mrs. Knapp was a sister of J.D. Witter. In his book of local history, Tom Taylor neglected to tell us who occupied the other two buildings in the photo, but one thing is sure, they were well within walking distance of the shopping area. Now we turn to the left and view the corner building occupied by Church's Drugstore. This photo was taken about 1904. The wagon and auto parked here seem to symbolize a changing era in personal transportation. Imagine the results if you tried to pose your automobile in the middle of this same intersection today. Steering one of these gas buggies on a dirt road was quite a chore, especially after a few heavy rainstorms, when the horses and wagons would make them a mass of deep and oozing ruts. The corner building was called Sam Church's Drugstore, having been named for the owner. In more recent years, the business was purchased by the Reisbeck family, and the name Church was retained as we know it today. It was just 6 years later, on January 11, 1910, that this photo was taken of the same corner. The trolley line had been in operation for just 10 days, and the newness of the car is quite apparent in this photo. The people of central Wisconsin were exceptionally proud of this new modern convenience, and the line did a thriving business. We can best appreciate what the streetcar service meant to the area when we consider that prior to this time, a simple winter trip to Port Edwards or Nakusa had to be taken in a cold sleigh or an unheated and unreliable car with plenty of warm clothes and blankets. Now, in the warmth of the trolley car, people could travel in their ordinary winter clothing with little concern for the weather. This picture was actually taken from a postcard which had been mailed to a recipient in Marshfield. The writer tells how she will make her first ride on the trolley car on Saturday night, having turned down a chance to go on a sleigh ride. It was written on January 14th by someone named Ida to a Mr. Adolph Geisha in Marshfield. Now let's move further west on Grand Avenue and relocate ourselves with another 1973 view, again taken from the same location as our next photo. Once again we go back in time. The year was 1894, and as previously mentioned, Grand Avenue is known as Cranberry Street. This photo shows the residence of Mr. and Mrs. John Dixon. Mrs. Dixon ran a boarding house for many years and later branched out for transient trade and had a very fine business. Later, with her son Charles, she built the brick hotel, which we now know as the Dixon, and used the dwelling as an annex. The new brick hotel is shown in this photo taken about 1905. Mrs. Dixon was the real landlord of the hotel, and her husband John helped run it. On the subject of Mrs. Dixon's husband, we'd be negligent not to mention that Johnny Dixon had a big red cow, which made Johnny very unpopular with local residents. In this picture, we see Johnny's cow standing in the exact present-day location of the main office of Consolidated Papers. The area was actually an island, but the surrounding water was shallow enough for the animals to cross. It was a favorite haunt of the cows that ran free in the city way back before 1900. This old cow earned herself quite a reputation for opening gates and leading her followers into the neighborhood gardens, bringing scandalous remarks to Johnny about his crumple-horned cow. Now back to our street scene. The tall structure on the right side of the street was located kitty-corner from the Dixon. This was the Anderson Hotel, having been named for its owner, a man named Nate Anderson. It was later purchased by a man named Joe Hayes, who came here from Dubuque, Iowa. Mr. Hayes changed the name to the Julian Hotel, as it is best remembered by old-timers. It was about 1907 when this picture was taken. Republican Teddy Roosevelt was serving his second term in the White House, and the local hotel was in its heyday. Old-timers tell us Sunday dinner at the Julian was a delightful experience, not soon to be forgotten. In the foreground is the city bandstand. What a treat it must have been for the Dixon and Julian Hotel guests to enjoy the band music on a warm summer evening, especially when we consider that Thomas Edison had first invented the phonograph only a few years earlier in 1877, when there were, of course, no radios or motion pictures. The Northwestern Railroad tracks are visible in the bottom foreground of the picture. These rails were to remain in our downtown area until 1973. When the tracks of both the Northwestern and Soo Line railroads were relocated to provide the city with an area for expansion of the West Side shopping district. The city of Centralia was especially noted for its fine school, and here on 8th Avenue at the present-day location of the Lowell School stood the Centralia High School. This building was the pride of the community. It was built about 1869, and here we see it as it appeared in 1897. Notice the endless piles of firewood in the schoolyard. This building later became the Lowell Grade School when the first Lincoln High School was built. The building was sold and torn down in 1924 when the present Lowell was built. A comment in the book, A History of Wood County, states, Centralia had a remarkably fine brick schoolhouse with good teachers, and the educational interests of the town were well cared for. Life was sometimes hard in the 1800s, but people did take time out for simple pleasures. In this photo taken at Lyons Park, we see lawyer G.L. Williams and his son Glenn on a beautiful Sunday morning enjoying a boat ride. The Northwestern Railroad Bridge is missing in this photo simply because it was not built until 1901. If you haven't already guessed, that's Johnny Dixon's cow once again in the foreground. It seems unthinkable that the herd didn't contribute a share of pollution to the river, but fishing must have been pretty good, judging from our next photo. Pollution or no pollution, these two anglers look as though they enjoyed life's little pleasures too. We can't say for certain if the fish came from the river, and they don't look like they were about to tell anyone. Perhaps we could have found the answer by asking around at some of the local saloons. In 1914, the world was shaken by the start of World War I. England, then France, became deeply involved, and Uncle Sam soon felt the pressure to join in. This famous poster was on display throughout the country, and to this day is considered a classic. By 1917, Grand Rapids had shared some of her finest young men in the cause of victory. By November 11, 1918, it was all over. The Kaiser defeated, the armistice signed. This is how the Grand Rapids Daily Leader spelled it out in their Monday, November 11th edition. Everyone rejoiced, for the boys would be coming home. This shot was taken from the second floor of the City Hall, looking north, as a Northwestern troop train pulled into the station. But it was not until July of the following year that the community would make the official welcome for all of the returning servicemen. The July 31st issue of the Wood County Reporter outlined an elaborate program for those who had served. On the local business scene, 1919 was indeed an eventful year. The community saw the merger of the Bank of Grand Rapids with the First National, and it was in that year that a young man named William F. Huffman bought the Daily Leader, launching his career in newspaper ownership. It was also the year that Consolidated Papers purchased the River Block to replace the old buildings with a new structure as we know it today. Yes, our community was growing up fast. Once again, it has been a pleasure to share with you some of the historical highlights of central Wisconsin. Realizing that there are many things left unsaid or not depicted in this short film, we invite you to join us again when next we bring you more of the wonderful history of this area in other films. While in pleasure we relive the past, in confidence we look to the future, planning with foresight, building with confidence. And ever present in the background is the helping hand of sound financial institutions, where people may borrow and save as their requirements dictate. Central Wisconsin, in step with today, in touch with tomorrow.